This video will address fair dealing, what it is, and how to determine whether a particular use of a copyright-protected work could qualify as fair dealing. The information in this video is intended for the St. FX community as a professional guide. It is not intended to be legal advice. Fair dealing is a provision in the Copyright Act that provides a balance between the rights of the copyright owner and the rights of users. Fair dealing is a user's right in copyright law that allows copyright-protected works to be used without permission or payment under certain circumstances, and provided that what is done with the work is fair. To determine whether a particular use meets the fair dealing standard, the use must be analyzed using two tests. The first test considers the dealing. The dealing, or the use, must be for one of the purposes explicitly named in the Copyright Act. These purposes are research, private study, education, parody, satire, criticism, review, or news reporting. If the purpose is for criticism, review, or news reporting, there is the added condition that the source must be mentioned in order for the use to qualify as fair dealing. The second test considers the fairness of the use. The Copyright Act does not define what is fair. Rather, it depends on the circumstances of individual uses. The Supreme Court of Canada identified 6 factors to consider when gauging the fairness of a use. We can think of this as a fairness scale, where factors can be rated as being more fair or less fair based on the facts of the particular use. Purpose is the first factor. Not to be confused with the purpose of the dealing in Test 1, which is a statutory requirement that must be satisfied in order for a use to be considered fair dealing. In Test 2, the fairness factor of purpose relates to the goal for which the use took place. For example, research is an allowable purpose, but research for a commercial purpose will be less fair than research for a non-commercial purpose. The character factor relates to the manner in which the material was used. For example, consider how widely reproductions were distributed, or if they were destroyed after the use. A single copy of a work, for an allowable purpose, is more fair than multiple copies that are widely distributed. The character also considers the practice or customary use in the particular industry or profession. A use which has been traditionally done in a certain profession is likely to be considered more fair. The amount factor considers not only how much of the work was used, but also how substantial or important was the portion used. If the portion used is considered less than substantial, no further analysis needs to be done. If the portion is beyond substantial, fair dealing may allow the use. For example, research and private study may require the copying of an entire work, such as an academic article. Also, some works, like images, are impossible to divide in a meaningful way, and thereby necessitate an entire copy. The portion used should contain no more than is required in order to achieve the desired fair dealing goal. The alternatives factor considers whether a non-copyrighted equivalent was available. In other words, did you need to use the work you used for the purpose? If non-copyright protected equivalents could be used instead of the copyright protected work, they should be considered. However, if the copyright protected work is a one-of-a-kind, use for an allowable purpose could be considered fair. Nature considers the publicity and exposure of the work as a result of the use. One of the goals of copyright law is wider public dissemination, so in some cases there may be a public interest served by wider dissemination of an original work. But public interest is also served by ensuring adequate returns to creators, so exposure that imposes on the creator's rights would be less fair. For example, the sharing of an unpublished work may be of public interest, but would impose the creator's rights if the work could be considered confidential. Effect considers whether the use affects the market of the original work. All factors must be considered. A dealing that creates competition would negatively impact the market of the original, but competition is not necessarily less fair. On the other hand, a dealing that eliminates market demand for a work, such as copying a textbook for students, would not be considered fair. It is not necessary that your use satisfy every one of the fairness factors in order to be fair, and no one factor is determinative by itself. One factor may be more significant and relevant in one situation and less in another. In assessing whether your use is fair, a court would look at the factors as a whole to determine if, on balance, your use is fair. If, having taken into account these considerations, the use can be characterized as fair, then it will fall within the fair dealing exception and will not require permission from the copyright owner. If the use cannot be characterized as fair, you will need to consider alternate means, such as another statutory exception or securing clearance from the copyright owner. If you have any questions about the content of this video or about any copyright issues, please email us at copyright@stfx.ca or visit the Campus Copyright Guide at the URL displayed on the screen for more information.